Riley and Nani were already outside, braving the elements as the rain continued to fall. Fortunately, they were well prepared with an umbrella to protect them from the downpour. As they walked, the prince turned to Nani and asked if she was enjoying what she was drinking. Nani, with a knowing look, replied that she knew it was alcohol. She mentioned that it tasted unlike anything she had ever tasted in the lower parts of Solia, and that was why she found it so surprising. Riley, curious, asked if the alcohol tasted better than she was used to. Nani, with a touch of sadness, admitted yes. They continued to walk through the wet, shiny streets. Riley then reminded Nani that he was now her assistant and asked her not to tell his mother about their drinking adventure, promising that it would be a little secret between them. He asked her if she understood, and with a resigned sigh, Nani agreed. Riley added a piece of advice. If they were going to Rainfield, it would be wiser to wear a raincoat rather than relying solely on an umbrella. However, he confessed that he had forgotten to bring his raincoat. The prince then considered buying one, but quickly remembered that Nani would also need one. This thoughtful gesture surprised Nani. As they talked, Nani morbidly commented that she would die soon anyway. Meanwhile, Bishop Rebosa was asking other priests if they had discovered the Lord's whereabouts. A priest respectfully reported that the Lord had gone on vacation yesterday. Rebosa pressed for the exact location, and the priest revealed that it was for Reinfeld. This revelation surprised Rebosa, and he questioned the information again. Dissatisfied with the news, he expressed his frustration with the need to go there. The priest laughed and commented that, of course, Rebosa had to go, as Riley was the goddess's chosen hero. Gathering his thoughts, the bishop declared that there was no time to waste and that preparations for departure had to be made. The young priest obeyed diligently. Someone called the Lord, and Rebosa seemed pleased to see the newcomer, Santa Frisia, standing before him, visibly tense. Frisia asked if Bishop Rebosa was going to meet the Lord. Riley, listening, reminded Rebosa not to touch him, implying that it would not be beneficial. Rebosa laughed and asked if this was also a prophecy, adding that if Frisia continued to abstain, he would consider it intentional. Rebosa insisted that he had to find his chosen one, emphasizing that Solia's fate depended on Riley. He corrected himself, stating that it was not just Solia's future, but the future of the entire world that was at stake. Rebosa stressed that this man had to save the world and questioned why the saint was advising him to leave Riley alone. Santa Frisia remained silent, contemplating Rebosa's intentions. Upon leaving, Frisia warned once again not to disturb Mr. Riley. Repeating her warning, Rebosa smiled mischievously, thanked Frisia for the warning and bowed. The girl glanced sideways at the bishop and then turned to the goddess Idnissa, questioning what the goddess's revelations about Bishop Rebosa meant. Meanwhile, Riley and Nani found themselves in a vast library. Nani was surprised to notice that it had not stopped raining all day and marveled at the fact that the books, despite the rainy weather, remained in perfect condition. Riley was surprised by what Nani had observed. She explained that the people of this place mastered a unique form of magic that kept everything in impeccable condition, regardless of the incessant rain. Nani then wondered aloud how it could rain every day. Riley admitted he didn't know anymore. The prince confessed that he was not sure of the rules that governed that place, but suggested that they make the most of it and have fun. He enthused that reading a book while listening to the relaxing sound of rain was a heavenly experience. Nani looked at the books around her with growing interest. Riley proposed a plan. They would split up, each choose a book, and then meet in the center of the library. Nani was hesitant, worried about her duty to protect Riley. Riley noticed her reluctance and asked if she thought he needed protection. Nani started to respond, but Riley interrupted, emphasizing that their task now was to choose a book, and whoever chose first would secure reading seats for both of them. Nani wandered between the rows of bookshelves, pondering which book to choose. She was unfamiliar with the library's collection and wondered what kind of books she could find there. She thought that in the Wizard's Tower, all the books she had read were about magic spells. To his surprise, he even spotted a book on how to make turkey pot pie. Suddenly, someone called out to her. Nani turned around and saw a red-haired girl nearby. It was Nara Basiliska. Nara, noticing Nani alone, questioned why she had left her master unattended. Nani, hiding the book behind her back, explained that she was looking for information about black magicians, hoping it might be useful. Nara asked about the books Nani had found. Nani revealed two titles, The Alcohol Fairy, Magic Tricks for Hangovers 101, and The Alcohol Fairy, Turkey Pies That Sober You Up Instantly 101. Nara teased Nani about her choice, insinuating that she was a drinker. Nani denied this, justifying that she thought it prudent to learn magic to stay sober. Nara accepted this explanation and reminded Nani of her promise, inviting her and Riley to visit again soon. As soon as Nani started to respond, they were interrupted by a series of screams. Both Nani and Nara turned around, startled. Nara asked if Nani had heard it too. Nani confirmed, noting that the screams seemed louder the second time. They ran away from the row of books, and Nara asked where Riley was. Nani explained that they had arranged to meet at the library center. Nara, claiming he knew the way, guided them as they ran. Nani asked what Nara thought could have caused the screams. Nara admitted that she wasn't sure, but she had a bad feeling about this. They made a few more laps, and Nara announced that they were almost there. When they reached the central hall, they came across a horrible scene. The bodies of several young people, both boys and girls, were spread across the floor and shelves, surrounded by pools of blood. Nara, horrified, asked what had happened. Nani covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with shock, and asked in a trembling voice who could have committed such a heinous act. She looked at one of the corpses, noticing with horror that it was still bleeding from the eyes and mouth. A wave of magical energy emanated from the body, and Nani, more amazed than ever, pointed it out to Nara. Nara turned around, equally surprised, and asked again what Nani meant. Nani reflected on the situation. She hadn't heard any explosions or other loud noises, which made her wonder if the wizard responsible had somehow suppressed the sound. She pondered the nature of the scream they had heard earlier. One thing was certain: the magical abilities of whoever had conjured this scene were of an incredibly high level. Turning to Nara, Nani asked her to think of Mr. Riley, to visualize him in her mind. Nara, confused and bombarded with questions, didn't understand what Nani was trying to achieve. Despite her many questions, Nani didn't give any answers, just shouted at Nara to stop talking and do it quickly. Reluctantly, Nara agreed. She closed her eyes and concentrated, trying to remember what Riley looked like. Meanwhile, Nani activated her magic eye, focusing her energy on locating her master. To her surprise, Nani discovered that Riley was on the first floor of the library. She relayed this information to Nara, who was still trying to process everything. Nani then painstakingly asked where the stairs were to climb. At first, Nara didn't respond, preoccupied with something else. Then he asked Nani to wait, mentioning that he might recognize the footprints they had seen earlier. Nani looked at the dark spots near the boy's feet, breathless and tense. Suddenly, some of the dead bodies began to rise, groaning angrily. Nara identified them as the revived dead, animated by dark magic. Nara's eyes burned with fury. Her anger was palpable. She gritted her teeth and told Nani that the black magician they were looking for was really there. Nara's anger intensified as she revealed that the black magician was responsible for her father's death and turning her brothers into monsters. She was sure that this black magician was nearby, and Nani turned to Nara, who warned that it was extremely dangerous to remain there. Nani suggested that they first find Mr. Riley and then move to a safer location. Nara was silent for a moment, then declared that if a true hero were present, he would prioritize evacuating the other people first. She added that her father would have done the same. Finally, she shouted to Nani to go find Riley while she searched for remaining survivors. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Nani nodded and asked Nara to be careful. She then hurriedly left and eventually found her master, calling out to him. Riley was surprised to see Nani there, noticing her heavy breathing and urgency. He asked if she had chosen a book and reminded her that they should meet in the main hall. Nani, still catching her breath, began to explain the dire situation. She told Riley that something horrible had happened in the library, which shocked the prince. He asked her to clarify what happened. Nani, raising her voice, revealed that a black magician was in the library, plotting something sinister. Riley, surprised, demanded to know what she was talking about and who this black mage was. He asked if Riley remembered the ogre that had chased them into Rhinefield Forest. The third prince nodded, recalling the harrowing encounter. He mentioned that he believed he had killed the ogre at the time, only to see it resurrected. Nani explained that a similar phenomenon was now happening in the library. The corpses had come back to life and were wandering throughout the building. Nani shouted that they needed to leave immediately. Riley mentioned the dead bodies and then approached the railing and looked down. From his position, he saw 2 employees of the Library of the Dead below, who upon noticing a living being, roared and began moving towards it aggressively. Riley leaned heavily on the railing, his body shaking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Nani, deeply worried, asked what was wrong. The prince, his voice shaking, said he felt like they were trapped in a zombie movie. Nani, unfamiliar with the term, did not understand the prince's reference. Riley, trying to regain her composure, stood up and moved to another part of the library, wondering if the high-pitched scream they had heard earlier was related to the current chaos. Nani confirmed his suspicion. Just then, a zombie growled and charged at them from behind. Riley, quickly realizing the danger, told Nani that he now understood the situation. He picked up a book and swung it hard, hitting the zombie square in the forehead. The creature staggered and finally fell to the ground. The prince, catching his breath, commented that he didn't think the situation was so serious that Nani needed to run to him with all her strength. Turning to face Nani, he saw 2 more former library employees lying on the floor behind him, now undead. Meanwhile, Nara wiped the sweat from her forehead, relieved that she had finally resolved the immediate threat. Suddenly, someone with white shoes entered the office. Now determined, Nara wanted to find the Black Magician. Alone in the spacious hallway, she recalled a traumatic childhood memory. She remembered how, when she was little, her father stood in front of her, defending her and shouting at the dark mage subordinate, demanding to know why they were being targeted. The black mage, dressed in a black robe, laughed cruelly, saying that he would end their suffering by turning them into soldiers for his army. Little Nara cried and begged her father to run away, while her father shouted back, accusing the black magician of having killed Uncle Tio and Sister Lana. The red-haired girl cried, unable to accept their fate, while her father, with a serious expression, told Nara that someone had to stop the black magician. Nara remembered touching her father's hand for the last time. She recalled his pained but smiling face as he told her to run, insisting that at least she could be saved. Summoning all her fighting spirit, Nara promised herself that she would find her father's killer and avenge him. Determined, Nara focused on her thoughts about the black magician. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice, scolding and shouting. It was the Black Wizard, demanding to know where the damn book, Clouds of Rainfield, was. He berated 3 library employees, calling them useless and ungrateful, despite restoring their brains and bringing them back to life. He scolded them for not being able to find a single book for him. One of the young men finally handed the wizard a book. The surprised wizard quickly picked it up and examined it closely. To his satisfaction, he realized that it was indeed the correct book he was looking for. He applauded and praised the boy, exclaiming that someone had finally found the book. He yelled at him, "You're doing a great job. Keep it up." Nara watched him closely, questioning if he could really be the Black Mage. The wizard, looking at the book, declared that, with its help, he would bring Joveracid to Reinfeld. Horrified by his words, Nara's anger increased. She demanded that he repeat what he had just said, her voice shaking with fury. Ignoring her, the wizard shouted triumphantly and laughed, announcing that a few hundred more warriors would soon join his army. He stated that all of this was to end his suffering. Nara, boiling with rage, was about to attack him, but the wizard managed to escape. The white shoes left a splash in the puddle as he disappeared. Meanwhile, Nani and Mr. Raleigh left the library and went down the stone stairs. It was still raining heavily. Nani turned to speak to Raleigh, but he silenced her with a gesture. Suddenly, Nara appeared behind them, calling out, "I Peter-san." When Riley responded, she mentioned that she still remembered him killing the ogre with a single blow. Recognizing her, Riley asked her name again. She didn't respond directly, but urgently said that she had just seen the black magician in the library. He added that, before disappearing, he had taken the book, The Clouds of Rainfield. Riley listened intently as she described the situation, mentioning that in the process, several hundred people had died. Clenching her trembling fists, Nara spoke about the wizard's meaningless speech about praying to end suffering. His eyes filled with tears as he looked up, finally saying that he saw strength in Raleigh and Nani. Raleigh looked at her seriously, asking if she wanted their help. Nara, her voice breaking, explained through tears that if the Black Mage succeeded in his plan and acid rain fell on Reinfeld, everyone would transform, just like the people in the library. She hadn't finished speaking when Raleigh interrupted, stating that everyone would turn into puppets. He asked if that was what she meant. Nara confirmed, with tears streaming down her face. Raleigh became irritated, expressing his frustration that there were always villains like the Black Wizard causing trouble. He then commented that it hadn't even been a week since their vacation started, implying that he couldn't help them. Nara, determined, begged for his help, saying that the Black Magician had killed her father. Raleigh, showing little empathy, repeated that he was on vacation and could not be bothered. He began to walk away, leaving Nani and Nara standing on the steps. Feeling desperate and abandoned, Nani tried to call her master, but he was already walking away. They stood next to a fruit vendor, and Riley pointed to something in the distance, clearly dismissing the situation as none of his concern. Meanwhile, Nara, refusing to give up, began actively distributing search flyers, hoping to attract the attention of local residents and gather any information that could help them find and stop the Black Mage. Nani pointed with her finger, directing Carl Raleigh's attention. All Raleigh could focus on was the fact that he was finally on a long-awaited vacation, his first in years. He had escaped the monotony of his responsibilities and was determined not to be drawn into dark and tedious stories. The prince knew he just wanted to enjoy his vacation and have fun. Despite the chaos around, this adventure excited Raleigh. As Nara ran through the city, full of urgency and stress, the word fun kept echoing in Raleigh's mind. He and Nani stopped, and she asked if he was having fun. Riley remained silent, his thoughts interrupted by the urgency of the situation. Suddenly, a wizard's voice interrupted his thoughts, asking who they were. Nara, full of anger and determination, didn't respond immediately. The wizard commented that he had not finished preparing for the acid rain that would soon fall on the city, boasting that it would not take long for his plans to be completed. He taunted that he would cut off the head of anyone who tried to interfere. The man in black laughed and challenged Nara, asking if she truly believed she could stop him. He repeated his question, demanding to know who she was. Nara's eyes burned with rage as she screamed that she had come to avenge the murder of her entire family. The wizard seemed to recognize Nara. He remembered those eyes. He shouted that he remembered vividly, those eyes watching as their bodies were consumed by his flames. Nara, surprised but resolute, pressed him further. The wizard admitted that he would never forget the sight of those eyes as they burned. He saw Nara's eyes now and remembered his family. The black magician claimed that he had granted those people immortality, and yet they were so ungrateful. Nara, angrier than ever, screamed at him to shut up. The wizard, pretending to be calm, asked if she wanted to try his fire too. Nara adopted a fighting stance, his eyes full of disdain. The wizard was delighted with the opportunity to eliminate those who had escaped him. At that moment, a purple aura appeared in the sky, a prelude to something ominous. The wizard raised his hand, and moments later, a weak, exhausted man appeared, with his nose and mouth drooping. Nara was shocked. Her knees gave way as she realized the man was her father. The wizard announced this reunion with perverse joy, savoring the moment after so many years. Nara was horrified, and the wizard couldn't contain his excitement, saying sarcastically that he might cry with joy. Despite his deteriorated appearance, Nara recognized his father. Gripping her weapon with renewed determination, she lunged at the wizard, screaming that she would kill him. The wizard mocked his fury, pretending to be scared. When Nara's arrow flew, it missed the wizard and hit someone else nearby. The wizard laughed, saying that he had helped her find her father and calling her ungrateful. Suddenly, the street lights went out, and a brilliant fireworks show began, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Nara, indomitable, flew towards the wizard from above, determined to end his reign of terror. Nini, Raleigh and the locals were completely captivated by the night show. The fireworks lit up the sky in a dazzling display of colors, leaving everyone in awe. The prince and Nini remained silent, watching the spectacle as the crowd around them marveled at the beauty and coolness of the fireworks, exclaiming how dazzling they were. The third prince maintained his silence, his expression neutral. Then, in a monotone voice, he told Nini how much fun he was having and asked how she was feeling. Nini was surprised by Raleigh's response and didn't respond immediately. Raleigh, not expecting an answer, suggested that perhaps she had expected too much from the evening, which led to her disappointment. Finally, Nini confessed that she was not enjoying herself at all. Raleigh smiled and asked why. Nini asked if her master really didn't know. Raleigh admitted he knew. Nini then suggested that maybe they should leave. However, the prince, focused on something else, mentioned that there was an insect in front of his eyes, and he was still not sure whether it would bite him or not. Meanwhile, Nara was locked in a fierce battle with the wizard. His mind was filled with a mix of determination and despair. She shouted about how excellent her entire family was, their courage unmatched. The wizard teased her, suggesting that they should add more people to their undead ranks. Suddenly, more corpses began to appear around Nara. She screamed at the wizard, calling him a bastard and wishing for his imminent death. Pointing his scythe at him, he prepared to attack. The black mage, smiling mischievously, asked if she would regret her action. Mana, her dark magic, wrapped around Nara's father's neck, using him as a shield. The wizard maneuvered so that Nara's attack pierced his own father. The immortal screamed in agony, blood already pouring from his eyes. Nara was horrified by this turn of events, calling out to her father in distress. She still held the gun that had pierced her closest relative. The wizard scoffed, stating that while she sought revenge, she couldn't actually hurt her own father. Nara shouted at him to stop talking nonsense. Suddenly, an arrow flew into his father's hand. It was the green-haired warrior, who shouted for Nara to come back quickly, reminding her that her father had already died a long time ago. The black mage finally noticed the warrior, realizing where his enemy's ally was hiding. Forming a sphere, he launched magical arrows towards the warrior. The warrior tried to deflect them with his hand, but the arrows caused him pain. The black mage mocked the warrior's efforts, declaring it a terrible misfortune that his archer had attacked him. He provoked the warrior to look at his companions, noting that they seemed frantically busy. The warrior realized that the people around him had been turned into zombies. He shouted to the commander that they could be surrounded at any moment. She shouted back that it was better if they left. Nara responded, shouting that he couldn't leave because he was her father. Two zombies charged at her from behind, growling fiercely. His green-haired ally shouted a warning. The wizard, laughing, trembled with malicious joy, questioning whether she could actually stab her own father. The wizard's words enraged Nara, adding fuel to the fire. He suggested that it would be ungrateful of her to do so. Nara, enraged, stood up from the wet ground, her eyes blazing with fury. She launched herself at the wizard with lightning speed. Her sharp staff pointed straight at him. She shouted furiously, demanding that he shut his ugly mouth. Seeing all this, the warrior was overcome with terror and shouted for the girl to stop before it was too late. However, it seemed like no one else was listening to her. The wizard, in response to the attack, just smiled. Nara threw his cold, deadly weapon directly at the man, aiming for his neck, his throat. Blood gushed from his lips, and he groaned in unbearable pain. But when the hood fell, it revealed Nara's father again. The unfortunate girl was stunned, realizing that she had once again hurt her loved one instead of that damned psychopath. Above his head, a cloud of black mana began to form. The wizard cast the air hammer spell. The dark magic rushed directly towards the astonished commander. The warrior, terrified, called Nara. The air hammer hit the poor woman, knocking her to the cold, damp ground. The warriors, both scared and excited, ran to the commander, asking if she was okay. The black magician, completely calm and satisfied, declared that they had reached the limit, the point of no return, and that it was therefore necessary to grant them immortality. He proclaimed that he had just completed all preparations. The green-haired warrior seemed to understand what the wizard was saying. The wizard, with a joyful expression, turned his face towards Reinfeld's night rain and shouted that from this moment on, the city and its inhabitants would live forever. Everyone would be one step closer to escaping their tiresome misery. As his face became completely drenched, he covered it with his hood and began a countdown. Nara, unable to do anything, sat helplessly on the ground, surrounded by terrified warriors. They realized that the black magician's nightmarish plans were about to come to fruition. The city was experiencing what could be its last clear, fresh rain. People strolled carelessly under umbrellas, unaware of the impending doom. As the wizard continued his countdown, Nara desperately begged him to stop. Begged with all her strength, but the only answer was the constant sound of rain. The wizard raised his hands. Lightning seemed to shoot from his body, reaching the sky. But then, something went wrong. The rain turned into something different nothing. The warriors and the wizard looked up, confused, at the dark sky. The wizard was also perplexed. The raindrops seemed to freeze in midair. Now, everything seemed so calm. The red-haired girl, having never seen anything like it, commented on the phenomenon as the drops froze. Suddenly, someone forcefully stood up from the ground and declared that they had finally found the wizard. It was the third prince, sword in hand, flying directly towards the wizard, calling him a disgusting idiot. Children on the streets told their mothers how raindrops were miraculously freezing in the air. Residents came out of their homes in shock. Having never witnessed anything like this before, they were scared, not understanding what was happening or if it was a good sign. A small child, mesmerized by the raindrops reflecting the city lights, commented that he didn't know what was happening, but he thought it was very beautiful. Someone nearby told another to watch the rain as it began to fall again, transforming the scene from eerie stillness back to its natural state. The child's mother and the man were captivated by the sheer beauty of the phenomenon unfolding before them. The night seemed truly magical. Vividly colored fireworks lit up the sky, while raindrops continued to drench the city, creating a mesmerizing scene. Riley realized that this meant Nani had made it after all. The black magician, noticing the prince, asked who he was. He commented on the sudden appearance of a sword in front of his nose, but complained that the prince had not bothered to introduce himself. Riley pondered whether the wizard was addressing him, even though the prince was also wearing a hood. Not expecting an answer, Riley thought it was obvious who he was and considered introductions unnecessary. Nara was extremely surprised to see Mr. Rolly there. She hadn't expected his presence and wondered what he was doing in that chaotic situation. Riley addressed the wizard, taunting him that despite all his preparations, his efforts had been in vain. He asked the wizard how it felt to see his plans thwarted and whether he liked the feeling of failure. These words seemed to deeply hurt the black magician, who became visibly angry. His once satisfied expression disappeared, replaced by a frown. The wizard vehemently denied the prince's words, not wanting to believe them. He screamed in anger over the rain and clouds, accusing Riley of stopping everyone from praying to escape their suffering. Riley, in response, asked why the wizard was so offended, implying that he wouldn't have intervened if the wizard hadn't ruined his vacation. The third prince's eyes turned cold and emotionless as he remembered that he wanted to say something more. Telepathically, he ordered Nani to act. The wizard was horrified, and Nara looked at the raindrops, realizing that it was Nani's work. The black magician tried to catch the distant raindrop, shouting, "These raindrops, where is the rain?" He cursed his new adversary. Riley found it funny that the wizard dared to call him ungrateful, despite having ruined his vacation. The wizard, now overwhelmed by Riley's magical power, called him an ungrateful brat. Riley stood firm, his feet seemingly anchored to the ground, sparking with energy. Someone behind Riley shouted a warning, reminding him that the wizard still had many puppets. Riley, although he did not stop listening, ignored the warning. He laughed, acknowledging the wizard's rare talent, but stating that he also possessed great talent. Bright blue mana swirled around the third prince of Ipita. Zombies screamed and charged at him from all directions. Riley concluded by saying that although the wizard was skilled, he was not a coward. With those words, Riley slashed the undead with a single swift movement, killing them once and for all. The wizard, angered by Riley's resistance, summoned more immortal dead, declaring that he could not let this continue. Suddenly, an ogre appeared before them. a terrifying sight even after enduring countless deaths. Near the ogre was a goblin, significantly smaller but still formidable. The psychopathic wizard had more in his arsenal, including his own dark wizard. This further piqued Riley's interest. They attacked the prince in every way possible, launching attacks from all directions, but Riley dodged each attack with ease, casually commenting that he felt sorry for them. He taunted the local black magician, saying that all he seemed capable of doing was manipulating puppets. This infuriated the previously jubilant wizard, who could not believe the audacity of Riley's words. Riley found himself surrounded by a circle of monsters and undead with various abilities. He challenged the wizard, saying that if he wanted to demonstrate his powers, he would need to do better than that. A particularly strong zombie charged towards Riley, who simply smiled and commented that such a display was insufficient. At that moment, something changed. Nara, watching in disbelief, wondered if the black mage could really control his creations now. The prince revealed that he was holding back, not using mana. He asked the sinister wizard how he felt about his abilities now and what he had to say about himself. Riley's excitement was palpable, her eyes shining with anticipation. With a mighty blow, the prince declared that the wizard must meet his end, his sword cutting through the air with lethal precision. The raindrops suspended before Nara's eyes separated due to the force of Riley's attack. He announced that they had finally captured the lunatic, and the black mage, now immobilized, was thrown towards a cliff. The mountain where he landed was full of fabric scraps and traces of mana. As the wizard's influence waned, the undead began to crumble, their garments disintegrating without the power of their creator. Nara looked at her father's grim remains, tears streaming down her face as she hoped his soul was finally at peace. Riley, however, was not particularly moved by the scene. Their thoughts were focused on the larger situation, considering Nani's role and how they were managing everything. Despite the blood dripping from her mouth, Nani smiled, relieved. Nearby, Nani stood atop the church bell tower, holding raindrops in her hands. She thought about how serene it felt to hold them in silence. However, his mana began to falter and break under the strain. Nani realized that he had tried too hard with the purification magic. A pool of blood formed on the stone floor beneath her, still growing. Nani understood that if he continued, he would die. Her mana reserves were depleting faster than she could replenish them. In a final effort, she focused on dispersing the remaining clouds, forcing herself to concentrate intensely. With one last exhale, Nani managed to clear the clouds in time. Below, people were still marveling at the beautiful and extraordinary night. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had saved them. Silently, she celebrated her achievement, reassuring herself that she had done it. The morning arrived with a light rain, unusual for Rainfield. The wind carried some newspapers, one of which Nani picked up. The letter inside described a strange phenomenon observed in the city. The rain suddenly stopped, and raindrops began to rise. The vision that opened up to the city's inhabitants quickly became the most important topic of discussion, dominating the headlines of every newspaper that day. The girl wanted to give the man the newspaper, but he told her to let it go. However, Nani was not paying attention to his words. His focus was elsewhere in the text. She read that the black magician, seen the day before in the library, had not been captured. The newspaper reported that the injured and the families of the deceased were outraged and blamed the guards of the library of the incompetent for their failures. Nani informed the prince that the press had concluded that the wizard had escaped capture. Riley commented that the Basilisk team seemed to have followed the mage, considering his work commendable. Nani agreed, suggesting that their efforts deserved recognition. Riley then asked if Nani intended to irritate him like she liked to do to Ian. Feeling a little embarrassed, Nani assured that she would not do that. Despite her initial discomfort, Nani expressed her happiness that they had managed to save innocent people. She reiterated her joy and hoped the prince would share it. Riley remained silent, simply waving his hand. The girl, fearing she had said something wrong, began to apologize, expecting to be reprimanded again. To his surprise, Riley placed a hand on his shoulder and asked him what was wrong, with a gentle attitude and even smiling. Riley acknowledged that he hadn't told her yet, but he thought she had done a good job. These words made a deep impression on Nani. He asked her to continue being diligent, and she calmly accepted the compliment. Riley then turned his attention to his drink, adding that he was feeling content. However, he noted that Nani seemed to be enjoying the vacation more than he was. Nani lowered her head and apologized louder this time, making the prince laugh and apologize again. He reminded her that they would need to return soon, as everyone at home must be worried. Nani looked up in surprise, a strange expression on her face. The water on her face mixed with her sweat, and she raised her head to the sky. Riley didn't understand what was happening to her and asked more seriously what she was doing all of a sudden. Nani turned to him, nervously replying that they had completely forgotten about each other. Riley found their behavior strange and asked what they had forgotten. She hesitated for a moment before saying that it seemed like they hadn't forgotten anything after all. Holding something in her hands, she said it didn't matter, dismissing the worry. At first, Riley didn't understand who hadn't been contacted. Then Nanny finally explained the situation. She pointed out that since their arrival in Reinfeld, they had never communicated with home. They had completely forgotten to make any contact. Riley was horrified, realizing he had actually forgotten. With trembling hands, Nanny handed a mirror to the prince, reminding him of their promise to communicate through it. Both were equally confused, with Riley questioning how they should proceed and what to do now. The prince lamented that everything was his fault, insisting that she should have taken responsibility for the situation. The girl screamed, repeatedly begging for his forgiveness. Behind Nanny appeared the image of a disgruntled mother. Riley, trying to calm her down, ordered her to stop apologizing and activate the communication device. The girl obeyed. In the mirror, the reflection of Lady Arras de Solia appeared, but she did not look as kind and cheerful as usual. Lady Arras asked sarcastically who was calling her, whether it was Riley. Now, all three were smiling awkwardly. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Lady Arras asked if her son wanted to explain why it took them so long to get in touch. Riley began to stammer, saying he would explain everything immediately. He hesitated, not knowing how much to reveal. The prince swallowed nervously. Now, Lady Arras turned her attention to Nanny, asking why she was so quiet. Nanny responded quickly. Lady Arras suspected they might be having communication problem, but Nanny assured her that everything was fine. Riley didn't understand why Nanny said that and asked if she had lost her mind. She shouted back that despite reading a lot of books, she still had common sense. Nanny tried to protest, but Riley interrupted, asking if she thought everything was her fault. The girl insisted it wasn't. Lady Arras could hear no more and sighed deeply. The mother asked if they were okay, if something had happened. Nanny assured him that everything was fine and nothing had happened, ensuring his safety. Lady Arras said it calmed her somewhat, but noted that nothing is that simple. Behind Lady Arras, Ian appeared. The old man was crying, sobbing and asking if they were okay. Riley reassured him, saying they would be back soon. Ian looked relieved. They also apologized to Ian and Lady Arras for calling so late. Lady Arras finally relaxed, returning to her usual demeanor, saying she was glad Riley understood. She added that he should know what to do after apologizing. Riley replied that he was sure and that it would not happen again. Lady Arras said that remembering was important and that they would be waiting for him at home soon. Suddenly, Sarah appeared next to Lady Arras. Lady Arras asked them to wait a moment because Sarah wanted to speak to Nanny. Nanny turned pale and greeted Lady Sarah. Riley laughed and told Sarah to teach Nanny a lesson. Sarah turned to a slightly irritated Nanny and reminded her that even if the prince had completely forgotten, it was still her duty to maintain contact with the house. Nanny apologized silently. Sarah shouted that it was Mr. Riley who had gone on vacation, not Nanny. Nanny bowed and apologized, saying she was sorry for her carelessness. Sarah exhaled and asked if she had seen the fireworks. Nanny nodded and confirmed yes. Sarah then asked how she was feeling. Nanny began to remember the beauty of that night and managed to say that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. The rain continued to wet the streetlights, creating a serene yet melancholy atmosphere. Meanwhile, Bishop Rebosa was at the edge of the cliff, the ancient battlefield. Traces of blood and the black magician's mana still remained. The bishop ran his finger over the remains and murmured that he had warned Uriel not to interfere. Clenching the mage's mana in his fist, he commented that everything was done in hopes of warding off suffering with prayers. The bishop realized that he needed to be much more vigilant from now on. Heavy wooden doors creaked open in front of him, and he wondered if this place could really be what he was looking for. Nara entered, looking around cautiously. Soon she directed her attention to Riley and Nanny, greeting them and mentioning that it had been a while since they last saw each other. Nara stated that she came to talk to them. Riley, curious, asked why. Nara hesitated before revealing that although she looked human, she was actually something else. She explained that she was the last survivor of her basilisk family, which had been very useful during the Great War, particularly under the heroic successor Han. Riley tried to recall any information related to this, pondering about Ian and the basilisk family. He wondered what Nara wanted and why he was there. Nara expressed that if they didn't mind, she wished to accompany them. Riley, still processing, asked again about his intentions. Nara took out a small bag, explaining that it was a request from her late father. She said that before he died, he had expressed a desire to see the Lord once again and wanted his ashes to be scattered after meeting him. Nara had begged the prince so fervently that he fell to his knees, surprising everyone around him. She begged them to take her with them to Solia. Soon, the carriage was on the rainy road, with Nara tending the horses, elated that they were finally leaving. However, Riley remained dissatisfied. He commented that just by looking at her, one could tell that she must fulfill Ian's wishes. Ian and Nara's tears were palpable, albeit for different reasons. Nanny's mood had improved a little, although her hands were still shaking. Riley turned to her, noticing her discomfort. The girl lowered her head, and he wondered where the sudden chill he felt came from. She didn't respond initially, prompting Riley to call her name again. Nani suspected that it might be because she had used a lot of mono recently. On the third call, Nani finally responded. Riley asked if she was feeling unwell. She insisted she was fine, repeating this to reassure him. Nani then reminded Riley of the conversation they had the day before with Lady Nara, mentioning that she had also spoken about the Basilisk family. The prince, intrigued, expressed his interest and said he had some questions. Nani explained that they had the ability to recognize a person's energy and the type of mana they possessed. Riley confirmed this, noting that they could indeed discern the nature of someone's mana. Nara intervened, emphasizing that they did not judge people by their appearance, but by their inner energy. She elaborated, explaining that there were several types of energies, red, blue and white, but also a dark purple one. She mentioned that Reinfeld's dark magician had exactly that kind of energy. Riley was surprised by the revelation about purple mana and asked her to tell him more about it. The girl agreed, but mentioned that perhaps it would be better to wait. The horses galloped quickly, then gradually slowed down. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Wow, what a coincidence!" A large, muscular man with a long mustache and dressed in peculiar armor approached them. He asked if the man in front of him was Captain Rock Thunder, marveling at how small the world was as they were meeting again after 6 months. He asked if they came from Rhinefield. Turning to Nara, he called her Cabal and asked if she was going there. Nara confirmed, saying that he had heard a rumor about a suspicious person, possibly a priest, hanging around there. She suspected it could be him. Cabal tensed and asked if she was crazy, questioning what kind of priest she was referring to. He then noticed the people in the carriage and asked who was traveling with it, speculating that they might be from a noble family. Based on the transportation, Nara, politely but firmly, told him not to meddle in matters that didn't concern him. Riley gave Cabal a stern look. The man laughed, commenting on the boy's explosive character. Observing the carriage, he speculated that they were probably aristocrats from a noble Ipiet family. Nara advised him to temper his curiosity and move on. Cabal laughed again, saying he understood, and then shouted that they would meet again. After he left, Nara continued, describing how disgusting purple mana types were. Riley asked if purple mana was common and if he had it too. Nara replied that it was rare and that she had only encountered 4 people with purple mana so far. She said she found one in an unnamed town, another who was a priest in Rainfield, and the man with a mustache they had just found in the forest. The 4th was the black magician. Riley was surprised to learn that there were only 4. Nara clarified that although she had only found 4, there could be others that she had not yet found. Meanwhile, Bishop Rebosa was close to Cabal. The large man turned to the bishop, announcing his arrival at Ebriol. Cabal addressed the black mage, who was always in the center, mocking him. He asked the bishop how long it would take, noting that the situation was serious and could take some time. He couldn't guarantee him anything. Cabal was furious that without his left arm, they could no longer fight like they used to. Rebosa tried to calm him down, but the man shouted back that it was easy for the bishop to remain calm since he still had both hands. Cabal demanded to know how they would manage without his left arm and slammed his massive weapon on the ground in frustration. Cabal's irritation increased as the other 2 members of his group had yet to appear. Rebosa explained that they were dealing with matters that required intellectual capabilities, which was why they could not be there, and asked for Cabal's understanding. Cabal, still angry, questioned what was wrong with his right arm. At this point, Rebosa was losing patience. Cabal grumbled, calling them ungrateful creatures. He then asked Rebosa what the next steps should be. Rebosa admitted that he didn't know exactly, but suggested that they start solving their problems little by little and keep moving forward. Cabal grumbled that in that case he would proceed to the prayer time. Rebosa suggested that they put a bandage on his left arm and wait for the right moment. Meanwhile, it was a bright morning, and the carriage had finally arrived in front of the mansion in Ipiet. There was no threat of rain. The weather was clear and sunny. Nani felt relieved and happy to be back home. Ian ran towards them, and Nani greeted her warmly. As usual, Ian threw himself into Nani's arms, crying tears of relief. Riley tried to calm her, reassuring her that they were safe now. He then asked the old man, Ian, to finally let him go. Ian shouted, asking if the prince could imagine how worried he was. He wiped his eyes with his shirt sleeve. A red-haired girl, Nara, looked at him in surprise and asked if he was the mercenary hero, Ian. The 3rd prince told Ian that it was time to stop crying and control himself. Then, he pointed to a girl next to him and introduced her, saying that she had come to talk to Han. Ian asked who the guest was and seemed to recognize Nara. Ian, not believing his eyes, started to speak, but Riley interrupted him, confirming that it was her. Nara approached the great mercenary hero, expressing that it was an honor to meet him. She started to introduce herself, but Ian interrupted her, asking if she was from the Basilisk family. Inside the mansion, on a table, was Nara's father's gunpowder bag, and Ian noted its significance, confirming that Gap, Nara's father, had indeed been murdered by the Black Mage. Ian, saddened, recognized that the Black Wizard had taken many lives, including those of loved ones. He told Nara that Gap had been an excellent mercenary and that she should be proud of her father. Ian praised Nara for her strength, noting how she had endured many hardships alone. Overcome with emotion, Nara began to cry. Ian then turned to Raleigh and informed him that as soon as the Earl arrived, he would let the prince know that Captain Rock Thunder had come to visit. Raleigh, confused, asked what he meant by "as soon as he arrived," since his father had gone elsewhere. Ian confirmed, "Yes, exactly. 2 days ago, he received a message from Solier Castle and left immediately." The old man added that it looked like someone was trying to attack Solier's borders. The prince then asked about the whereabouts of his brothers. The old man explained that they stayed to ensure that the house would not be left unattended. Riley then asked if her mother was home. The old man responded affirmatively, adding that she had something important to tell him. Suddenly, Riley turned around sharply. Feeling something wrong, he asked aloud what was going on. His concern increased when he noticed a broken plate on the floor. Riley called out to Naney. Realizing she had dropped her plate, she looked at her shaking hands in shock, unable to control the shaking. Seeing her suffering, Riley ran to the kitchen where Naney was. He held her and watched her entire body tremble. Naney, trying to hide her condition, insisted that she was fine and would clean up immediately. She asked Riley not to worry about her. Riley, however, held her hand firmly and asked how she planned to clean with such shaking hands. Naney couldn't respond and mumbled something to herself. She seemed deeply troubled and apologized profusely. She promised to work even harder from now on, vowing to do her best. She begged him, "Please don't leave me." They found themselves sitting on the floor. Riley called his name, trying to get his attention. He asked if she could hear him and urged her to wake up. He called her name louder, but she didn't respond. Eventually, Naney woke up and opened her eyes slightly. Riley and Endal were by his side. The dragon asked Riley what the maiden's name was. Riley replied, "Her name is Naney." Endal commented that it seemed to be in bad shape and that it would only last until autumn at this rate. Riley added that she constantly insisted she was fine, even when she could barely stand. He expressed confusion about why she couldn't take a break. Endal observed that the world had different types of people, some who bore their pain and burdens until the end. He mentioned that there were people like Naney who he considered foolish for trying so hard. Riley knew he was like this too under Beck's guise, feeling the pressure to save the world and meet everyone's expectations, working tirelessly for the good of others. However, this relentless drive had left him completely exhausted. Endal observed Naney lying next to Riley and commented on the incredible nature of humans, suggesting that their short lives could lead them to such extremes. Riley agreed, remembering Naney's words about finding joy in his work. He knew that she had used a lot of mana on Reinfeld, which had shortened the already limited time she had. Riley turned to Endal, remembering the dragon's offer to teleport them once in exchange for Naney. Endal remembered and asked if Riley was ready to hand her over. Riley was surprised by this assumption and quickly clarified that he was not referring to that. Endal asked what they should do. Riley, turning to Naney, begged Endal to save her. Apples appeared on the big tree outside. From the window, Naney watched the apple, but she also noticed Riley sitting next to the tree as usual. She knew the weather was getting colder, and sleeping outside in these conditions could quickly lead to illness. To his surprise, Riley was awake, which was unusual. Something had changed. Behind them, tall buildings rose. Naney wondered about the origin of her strange feeling. In reality, she was among huge skyscrapers, completely alien to her world. Cars, an unfamiliar sight to her, moved through the streets. These imposing buildings were wild and overwhelming to her. People crowded the sidewalks, but one figure stood out. Naney wondered if he could really be the gentleman. Riley looked incredibly angry, shouting furiously. He screamed, defending himself against something, trying to protect himself with his arms. Despite her precarious condition, Naney immediately left her quarters and ran towards Riley, her worry driving her. The pain in her body forced her to stop and groan. Hun approached her from behind, placing a hand on her shoulder, and advised Naney to rest for the day. And Ian explained that Zara had mentioned that Naney was unwell. Naney lied, insisting that she was fine and perfectly capable. Turning away from Ian, she insisted everything was fine. Ian, looking at her with concern, asked if she was shaking like a leaf for no reason. It was true. Naney's body could not find peace and was shaking uncontrollably. Trying to hide the visible tremor, she held her stomach. Ian stood in front of her, firmly telling her to go and rest. Naney wanted to protest, but it was useless. His tone and words scared her a little, so she finally gave in. After Naney left, Ian turned to young Riley and asked if everything was okay. Riley, rubbing her head, explained that she had just had a nightmare. Meanwhile, Naney had to lean against the wall, feeling unwell again. She coughed up a lot of blood, which ran down her hand as she covered her mouth. Riley, seeing her, asked how she was. Naney was unable to respond. His vision blurred, his eyes slowly closing as everything around him faded. She tried to call out for Riley, but was interrupted by a violent cough. Ian and Riley rushed to her side, calling her name, begging her to stay with them. Soon, Nanny was lying on the bed. The second and first children of the family were in the room, looking for something. The second son told his brother he wasn't there. The first remained silent. Suddenly, Nanny coughed heavily again, and a bright red blood stain appeared on the white pillowcase. At that moment, the boys turned their attention to Nanny. The insolent second son shouted at his brother to stop just looking at her, furious and insulted that a maid was lying on the bed resting. After Lloyd's attack, the first son firmly held his hand, stopping him. They both noticed the blood on the bed and on Nanny's arm. The first son firmly said to leave her alone. His brother's authoritative words silenced Lloyd, making him question if he had heard wrong. The older brother remained quiet, then shouted that their father would not have left her in this state. He reminded Lloyd of his father's courage in saving children from fires. Suddenly, the first son slapped Lloyd hard on the cheek, the sound echoing through the room. He sternly advised Lloyd to wake up and look at the blood on the pillow. He said Lloyd wasn't a survivor anyway, so he should leave her and let her die. Lloyd was silent, not knowing how to respond, clearly surprised by his brother's harsh words. Then, they both turned as Indal entered the room, wearing glasses and a doctor's coat. Indal wedged himself between the brothers, completely ignoring them, and declared that it was time to examine Nanny. Exclaiming that her condition was dire, he demanded to know what the brothers had been doing all this time, leaving them confused. The first brother even asked who Indal was, but Indal ignored the question. He focused on Nanny and stated that her condition contradicted the strength of her character. It suggested that if she recovered, she would become even stronger. Intrigued, he examined her more closely. Frustrated, the older brother shouted at Indal, demanding to know who he was and pointing his long, sharp sword at the dragon's neck. Indal didn't like having a gun pointed at him, but he finally introduced himself. The older brother, displeased, asked if Indal was his name. Indal, not as polite as Nanny, reiterated that he was indeed Indal. The first son laughed sarcastically and asked if that was really his name. The red-haired dragon turned to the boy, showing a smile with sharp teeth, and asked what he meant by that. Approaching the aristocrats, Indal explained what he was observing, which sparked their interest. He confirmed that his name was Indal and asked what they wanted to know next. Standing before them, he seemed to glow from the inside out, his eyes wide. One of the brothers asked again who he was and why he was there. Indal smiled widely, adjusted his glasses and said he was a doctor, asking if there was any problem with that. The first son had millions of questions for the stranger, his mind buzzing with curiosity and concern. Lloyd was about to question Indal's seriousness about being a doctor when Raleigh entered the room. Greeting the doctor with a smile, Raleigh said, "I'm glad to see you here." He apologized to his brothers for not introducing them to Indal sooner and explained that he was the doctor he had brought from REINCARNATED. Raleigh hugged Indal and turned to his relatives, explaining that he had forgotten to mention the doctor's arrival because he was worried about his mother's worsening chronic illness. The brothers were momentarily confused, struggling to understand Raleigh's explanation. Raleigh confirmed this, saying that his mother's illness was indeed getting worse, which worried him. Smiling widely, he asked Indal to confirm the story. Indal took a step back and stated that they had indeed forgotten about him. Indal continued, mentioning that he had tried to tell them he was a doctor before. The family's oldest brother raised his hand and acknowledged that Indal was a doctor, but demanded to know why he had been so rude to them. Indal looked at him seriously, then smiled and said that the young man was funny. He called him a brat and advised him to be grateful for being alive after pointing a sword at him. The first son gritted his teeth in anger, struggling to contain his fury. He drew his sword again, this time striking harder, and shouted that Indal was a bastard. The dragon's red eyes fixed on the aristocrat, paralyzing him with fear. The man was shocked, unable to move, feeling an overwhelming tension as if he was being crushed by an invisible force. It was then that Nanny intervened, holding her head and shouting for them to stop. Riley immediately ran towards her, asking what was wrong. Nanny, sitting on the bed with a look of astonishment, asked the young gentleman where he was and how long he had slept. Riley told her that she had slept until noon. Determined, Nanny said it was time to get up as work awaited her, and she didn't want to focus on her health. Nanny walked away silently, everyone watching her as she walked away, leaving behind an invisible trail of her life's blood. Someone commented that she couldn't stay there any longer. On a golden afternoon, the sunset bathed the Sword Clan Manor. All the maids and servants gathered at the entrance, some crying, others visibly sad. Nanny's black hair blew in the wind as bitter tears ran down her face. She was next to Indal, who was silently observing the scene. 2 hours before Nanny left, Zara was also crying. She felt terribly guilty for not being able to help Nanny enough. Zara hugged Nanny tightly, with Ian standing behind them, trying to remain calm despite his sadness. 30 minutes later, Zara and Nani were still hugging each other. After another hour, old Ian joined them, unable to contain his emotions any longer. The three stood together, sharing their pain and the poignant moment of goodbye. Riley couldn't bear to see them cry any longer. He wished they would stop shedding tears. Trying to change the mood, he called out to Zara, reminding her that she had mentioned wanting to give him something. Zara, wiping her nose, watched the two girls with pity. Zara then presented her favorite scarf. The maid handed Nani a damp but very nice and clean handkerchief. Nani accepted him kindly and promised Zara that she would keep him safe. Then Ian drew his long sword, handed it to Nani and said it was for her too. He reminded her that she was now part of the Ipiet family. Nani was incredibly surprised by this gesture and initially couldn't find the words to respond. Holding the sword and scarf tightly in her hands, she heard the boys promise that they would wait for her return, although Sarah specified that they were waiting not for her, but for Mr. Rolly. Ian placed his hand on Nani's shoulder, urging her to assure him that she would return. At that moment, the door of the mansion opened and Lady Iris ran in with a blue bow in her hand. Lady Iris called her, asking if Nani was still there, announcing that she also had something for her. Despite knowing the gravity of the situation, Lady Iris hid her sadness behind a radiant smile. The blue bow hung elegantly on her arm. Nani hurriedly put the long and heavy sword under her arm, saying Lady Iris to wait, as his hands were full. Lady Iris turned her back to Nani and started tying the blue bow on Nani's long black hair. Soon, Nani had an elegant and delicate blue bow in her hair. She bowed and thanked first Lady Iris and then to everyone else. Rolly, sitting silently with his hands behind his head, watched the scene. Sira approached him and asked if he wanted to give something to Nani. The protagonist approached Nani hesitantly and handed her a red apple, saying that would be enough. He asked her if she was okay, which surprised Nani. Rolly, sitting beside the tree with his hands behind his head as usual, was there while Nani remained by his side. She cried out to the young master that her best moments had already passed and that she feared she would die soon, asking to stay with him until the end. Riley responded by telling Nani that her illness could be cured. His words had a profound effect on her. She asked him to repeat what he had said, and Riley pointed upward, directing his attention to a red apple that was about to fall. Nani watched her closely as Riley assured her that he could save her. When he handed the apple to Nani, he expressed his hope that she would live to help him pick more apples. The sun shone brightly behind the trees full of green leaves. Endal began to speak, signaling that it was time to leave. Now, he and Nani were walking along the path away from the clan and Pellet. Endal told her that from now on, she was his apprentice. Nani, confused, asked what he meant by apprentice. Endal, smiling widely and revealing his sharp teeth, confirmed her statement and suggested that she try calling him master or mentor. Nani's voice trembled as she said the word mentor, but Endal was delighted. Endal replied exuberantly, "Yes, that's better. It sounds wonderful." The boy laughed heartily, clearly enjoying the word mentor. Unlike him, Nani was not so excited. As she walked, she looked around the property, perhaps for the last time. She had promised herself that she would recover and come back, and she repeated that promise to herself. Later, they passed some lit tents. Inside a tent, a group of important people were in discussion. One of them mentioned that he had managed to secure a temporary truce. A bald man commented that he did not expect Antrian to be the first to attack the borders. Another white-haired man said attacking the borders was only half the problem. The bigger problem, he noted, was the mercenary involved in the attack. The men confirmed that the rumors about the mercenary's extraordinary strength were true. They depicted a burly warrior with a long mustache, watching how many warriors fell into his hands. They added that if it weren't for Stig and Pelleter, they would have lost the battle. A man with blonde hair and blue eyes, who seemed to be in command, suddenly stood up and slammed his hands on the table, insisting that they not underestimate the mercenaries. He demanded that everyone present understand this clearly. Then he asked the man with long black hair how things were this time. The man laughed nervously, lowering his head, and replied that the situation was far from ideal. When pressed for details, he explained that it was not possible to reattach Orostan's right arm, which had been severed in battle. The blonde leader was furious and didn't know how to deal with the situation. He ordered the entire Kabbalah team, including himself, to be placed on high alert. He emphasized that the Count's sacrifice should not be in vain. Meanwhile, Count Stein was in his quarters, bedridden and feeling unwell. The girls serving the Rabosa Bishop's church were busy around him. One of them wondered aloud whether they should inform the Shire of the Earl's condition. Another questioned whether an heir had been chosen, and a third lamented the great misfortune. Outside, the sky darkened with black clouds, foreshadowing an impending storm. The property looked grey and gloomy. Inside, Lloyd, the second son, paced the red carpet. He remembered his brother's harsh words, telling her to wake up and accept that she was going to die no matter what. The words, although shocking, remained in his mind. Lloyd couldn't understand why his brother had changed so suddenly. He thought about how his father, brother, and mother always seemed to do the right thing. These thoughts tormented Lloyd. Clutching his head, he screamed to himself, trying to banish the disturbing thoughts. The second son looked out the window, lost in his tumultuous thoughts. In the courtyard, he saw Rolly and old Ian. Suddenly, a voice called everyone, announcing the arrival of the story, but warning of a trap. Excitement gripped the three brothers as they ran to their father's side. They weren't the only ones eager to hear the news. Servants and maids were equally nervous, with Nara following behind them. As she curiously looked at the Earl amongst the crowd, the aura of an individual caught her attention. That person was Orristan, whose presence was marked by a powerful purple aura. His red eyes were fixed on Bishop Rebosa, who was meticulously preparing Orristan in every way possible. Nara looked at her hand, noticing that it had turned purple, and was perplexed by the sight. She wondered what the idiot was doing there, given the clear malice in his yellow eyes. This disturbing presence made her question his intentions and why he was involved in her affairs.